So we're going to finish off Chapter 9 by looking at Section 9.4. It's the last section that we're going to do. The chapter is actually much longer in the textbook. There is additional information in there, but we're just going to kind of stop here because we've done enough comparisons at this point with what we've seen in previous chapters. So in Chapter 8, we learned one important technique for statistical inference was the hypothesis test. So in this section, we're going to use the same technique, but instead of looking at population proportions, we're going to look at means of populations. So our testing procedure is going to be the same thing that we saw in our previous chapter. We start with our hypotheses, then we choose a significance level and test statistic. We check our conditions and assumptions. We actually do our computations like we did before. We're going to rely on StatCrunch to do this, and then we're going to interpret our final result. So just a few details of some of the slight changes or notation as we're going through. So for our hypotheses, we still have similar null and alternative hypotheses. Our null hypothesis still has an equal sign. Our alternative hypotheses are either two-sided or one-sided based on the words that we see. But instead of seeing p equal to something, we see mu equal to something. And that mu naught is going to be our value that we are being compared to. Right? So again, very similar setup, slightly different notation because we're talking about a different type of parameter. We're talking about a mean, not a population proportion. Our conditions. So before we do that, we will want to check our conditions. Right. Sample is random and independent. We have a large enough sample. Again, we're going to use that 25 as our cutoff, and then a large enough population. We're just going to kind of skip condition 3, assuming that it's already been met based on our sample size. Our details of our test statistic. So we kind of mentioned that we're thinking about a t-distribution. We talked about different things. We talked about our degrees of freedom. So our formula for our t-statistic is slightly different than the one that we saw before for z. Again, we're not going to worry too much about this calculation because we're choosing to use StatCrunch to do these problems for us instead. As far as our t-test goes for our hypothesis testing, we're going to go into the same menu that we did in the previous section. So we're going to go to stats. Again, the big difference is here we want to make sure we select t-stats, one sample with summary. We're going to enter those 3 values. Right? So those same 3 values, our mean, our standard deviation, and our sample size. We're going to select our hypothesis, enter the null and alternative hypothesis. Don't forget to enter the number, right? Enter the number for mu naught into these when you're entering them in. So if you're comparing it to a mu naught value of, let's say, 25, make sure when you are selecting your hypothesis test and selecting the right signs that you are also putting in that correct value as well. And then once we do that, we are going to select compute. And then once we have our values, we're going to analyze and interpret like we did in the previous chapter 8.